Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here as a hush falls over the room. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you to this morning's speaker, Dr. Tonya M, a thought leader in museum engagement and open classroom hands-on STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and math education. Dr. Matthews serves as the Michigan Science Center's Chief Executive Officer and President. Her diverse background includes academic and professional work as a Ph.D. scientist, educator, community volunteer, and award-winning writer and poet. Dr. Matthews is the Michigan Science Center's first permanent chief executive and has led its climb to becoming the STEM hub for Greater Detroit and the state of Michigan. Previously, Dr. Matthews served as Vice President of Museums for Cincinnati Museum Center, directing the education, research, and community engagement footprints of a multi-site museum and research institution. She created the Museum Center's signature program in early childhood educator training in science that annually trains more than 150 teachers throughout the region with measurable classroom impact. Prior to that role, Dr. Matthews worked with the Maryland Science Center as manager of BodyLink, an innovative multimedia education center focused on biotechnology. While at the Maryland Science Center, she created an outreach lab program for city high school students through formation of an institutional partnership between the Science Center, the National Institutes of Health, the University of Maryland, and the Baltimore City Health Department. These early experiences helped shape Dr. Matthews' strategic philosophy that program and institutional sustainability is best supported through strong, meaningful private, public, corporate partnerships and by positioning museums as collaborative community education partners. Dr. Matthews is also a published performing poet. As a writer, she is noted for her insightful social commentary and poetry-based community engagement. Dr. Matthews has served as adjunct and visiting faculty at several colleges, including Stevenson College in Maryland and George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After completing her studies at Duke University in biomedical and electrical engineering, Dr. Matthews received her doctorate in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Her undergraduate degree includes a certificate in African and African American Studies. She is the recipient of a Whitaker Foundation Award for Engineering Excellence and alumni member of the National Society of Black Engineers and the Society for Women Engineers. Always actively engaged in the work of building community, Dr. Matthews currently serves as a board member for Detroit Cristo Rey High School, Midtown Detroit, Culture Source, and Detroit Public Television. Additionally, Dr. Matthews sits on the board for the American Alliance of Museums in Chatfield College. Throughout her studies and varied work experiences, Dr. Matthews continues to teach, learn, and engage, finding a perfect home with museums, a field that thrives on community partnerships and a commitment to all children and every lifelong learner. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthews.
Good morning. Okay. Because we gave you coffee. Okay, so the French toast was a bit much. I admit that, but let's try one more time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for responding to the bombastic American. I appreciate really being here, and I want to thank everyone at the Ontario Museums Association and the Conference Planning Committee for inviting me to have a conversation with you about something as interesting as borders and defining borders. I'm really excited, actually, to be here, and when I was thinking about the theme, and what I would talk about, I started thinking about my experience of coming to the Michigan Science Center. I've been there for about 2 years now, just a little over 2 years, and run into all kinds of borders, the least of which was the Canadian border. And so, for example, we have a very curious border in Detroit known as 8 Mile. Now, some of you have seen the movie, and you remember the work of Eminem. You gave us Justin Bieber. We gave you Eminem. That's cultural exchange. That's how that works. But it's very interesting because it is more than a movie. That single street is frankly more effective in keeping people separated from each other than the Great Wall of China. It is an absolute phenomenon. And as an organization that was trying to be the hub of the state, let alone the hub of, a 35-mile radius, it was very, very interesting in terms of the conversations we had to have about getting people who are on one side of the road to cross into the other side of the road and know that it was okay to sort of be in this inner circle. And so that's been really, really interesting and has given me sort of a lot of food for thought in talking about the deliberateness of crossing borders. So let's start with killing a misconception. So, all border crossing looks like this. So the illusion that some borders are easier to cross than others is really us fooling ourselves. We always have to be this deliberate. And there's always just about this much element of danger. I don't know what this gentleman is doing. Clearly, his feet are not on the ground and he's only holding up on one arm. I'm seeing some little musculature there, but not quite what I want to depend on to hold 200 pounds suspended in the air. And the other thing about this is, of course, we cannot see what's on the other side. Whether the borders that we're talking about are invisible or blatant, intangible, or solid as a rock, there is always deliberateness involved with getting across these borders. And we need to remember that and take that into account. And I think if we think about the work that we do, there are a lot of ways to sum up what museums, libraries, archives, science centers, parks, aquariums, zoos, there are a lot of ways to sum up the kinds of things that we do. But at the end of the day, we are inviting audiences to be curious, to learn something they've never learned before, to talk to someone they've never talked to before, to see their experience in an experience that they've never heard of. And this is, in fact, border crossing. So let's at least, as we get into the discussion, get into a common definition of border. It's like a classic presenter's trick. You want to talk about something, so you go to the dictionary and you find the coolest definition you could find, and then you, wax poetic or create an acronym or something about it. So there are all these kinds of definitions of borders, used as a noun and a verb, and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, a border is simply a line that separates. It's going to separate something from something else, whether or not you're talking about being on the boundary or being on the edge, political, social, keeping your younger brother out of your room. I've got one, I've done that. But at the end of the day, we're really just talking about a line that separates. It is essentially code for places we don't want to go or have been told that we cannot go. There are two types of borders. The kind that we build, so we're familiar with those. Walls, fences, state lines, border patrol, passport control. Borders can also be that we build reputations that we have for our institution, membership criteria, admission pricing, pedigree. All of these things can be borders to entry, whether or not they're a physical wall or intangible things that you pick up on that are a subtle indication of where you should and should not be. So there's the kind of border that we build, and there's also the kind of border that we bring. So I think one of the things to acknowledge is that all of us have defined our world in some way that fits and helps us. And when we do that, we are actually always bringing our own particular borders to the table. Everything from bias to judgment to entitlement to, those classic sentence starters. We're most familiar with, well, those people, which is really easy to identify as a border. But when folks start to say, well, the last time I did this, this happens, there's a border there. My mother always told me that's a big border. That's a big border. If you're trying to cross a border that has anything to do with what the mother always said, you're going to have to do some extra work there. These borders are often self-imposed. Fear can be a border, and so can guilt. So I think in terms of our work and redefining borders and thinking about getting across these borders, We need to remember that there are the kinds that have been built up, but there are also the kinds that visitors are bringing to us. And unfortunately, it's never just one intersection. We're always going to be running into both. So not only are we looking at asking our visitors or those we serve to cross borders that we have built, it could be our Museum on the Hill reputation, the idea that museums are just for smart people. You know, I recently got married, and my husband throws out the word smart people like some people throw out the word Arab. You smart people. You smart people do this. You smart people think this. You know, you're one of those smart people. And it always, this works for you and that kind of thing. And so I think to remember that borders are real to whoever is describing them. And we actually need to acknowledge when we have some culpability in putting them there. And then they're also bringing with them their own borders. I've never been to a museum before, right? Which is our holy grail. We want someone who's never been before. That's why we create these amazing advertising campaigns. This is the only reason we are on Twitter. All right, we are trying to get people who have never been to a museum to come to a museum and think about us differently. We are trying to get a child with an iPad and a smartphone to actually put his or her hands on a book. This is what we're trying to do. And I think that when we do that, we also need to remember and to acknowledge perhaps their bravery. Because in those cases, they are actually crossing a border. And I think the other thing that we have to come to grips with is that some of these borders were put there on purpose. And there was a time when we were proud of them. And that if we think that our audience doesn't know that, and if we think that the people we're inviting to the table don't remember that, I think we're missing something. I think we're missing the opportunity to frankly be really aggressive about tearing these borders down. And of course, I'm talking about individuals and our relationship with our individual audience members right now, but this just as easily and probably more often applies to bigger concepts like partnerships across sectors, across provinces, across native languages, across communities, across churches and denominations. So whenever you're making these big leaps in crossing and creating these partnerships and collaborations, that is border crossing. Now, to get past all of this, you know, there's a list of things. You can have your checklist, what am I crossing today? And maybe there's a different tactic for each crossing. But the truth of the matter is, to get past all of this, you actually have to be trying. This is not one of those build it and they will come things. And it's not as simple as just being nice. Sometimes you've got to do more than open the door. You've also got to be able to give the call for people to actually cross a border and to know that their name is being called. And so that is where I'm talking about the concept of the deliberateness of crossing the border. Not just the idea of creating a space where we can all get together, but being deliberate about the idea that folks will actually be crossing borders. So I talked about the two types of borders, the kinds we build and the kinds we bring. There are two types of borders because borders serve two types of purposes. So this is a quote. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in and what I was walling out. So I think it's important to remember that fences and things like that come up for those two different reasons. This is a line from Robert Frost's poem, The Mending Wall, and mostly the line that we actually remember is this is the poem where that line, good fences make good neighbors, actually comes from. The funny thing about this poem is we often forget that the narrator is the one trying to use the wall as a way of building a relationship with the neighbor. And the neighbor is on the other side reminding him that good fences make good neighbors. And so towards the end of the poem, the speaker is asking, well, if I was going to build a wall, I'd really want to be sure of what I was trying to keep out and what I was trying to keep in. And I think he ends by questioning either. So keeping that in mind, some borders are keeping us in, some borders are keeping us out. So let's talk about the actual crossing. Let's talk about getting up and over, around or under these borders, or frankly just blowing them up. So I think in terms of a practical sense, I want to talk about 3 traits that I consider necessary for every successful border crossing, regardless of how you define them. So the first is curiosity. Okay, so this, for those who can see, so this is me getting ready last night. As the bio said, I am an engineer, very type A. I lay stuff out so that I can get dressed in the morning. Those are my earrings, my badge, and my passport, and my poppy. I am very proud of my poppy because I had no idea what it was for 36 hours ago. So I came over and checked into the hotel, and I'm seeing some people, and I didn't really catch it then, but then I turned on the TV, and everybody had puppies on. The newsmen, the anchor people, everyone they talked to, they had this flower. Actually, I have to say it was a flower before I looked it up and discovered it was actually a poppy. So I started to look, I was curious. I wanted to know what that was about. So I got on there. There is no excuse for not feeding your curiosity in the age of Google. There just isn't, okay? And so I went on, and then I discovered what it was about. I learned about Remembrance Day, and then I learned that it was a poppy, and that there's a red one, and there's a white one. And I learned that it is very similar to, say, Veterans Day. And then I learned that different countries and different communities all over the world have these different ways of remembering this, and most are actually around the same day. And then I was trying to figure out, but that day is not until next week. Why are we wearing the poppies today? And so then I did some more digging and found out that here, we actually wear the poppies leading up to it. So then I went down to the front desk and I had a question about how to get up here, and they had a box of poppies that I could actually get. And it was very interesting for me because I had been curious and I had learned what it was about, and they had this box, which was kind of an open invitation. And I kind of reached for the poppy. No one said, Americans can't do that. So I said, okay. So I said, because when you're crossing a border, like sometimes you have to bring your ballet slippers and sometimes you have to bring your combat boots. So trying to figure out just the type of border crossing sort of that this would be. And and it was very interesting, and I put on the poppy and I just sort of went around my business, and I felt this sense of sort of welcome and belonging. And I was not only proud of myself for having crossed this border, but I was also really excited that no one stopped me at the border in terms of doing it. As a matter of fact, some people just started speaking French to me, which I found very impressive. Very impressive. So in terms of that, so the first thing I think that is required of a successful border crossing is curiosity, right? It is a very common thing. It is a human thing. It is frankly what differentiates us from the rest of the species, and this works on both sides. Me as a visitor and a consumer being curious, and also you as a provider of the information being curious about why I am curious and what is this conversation just about to be about. The cool thing about this is that borders don't really work very well with culture. Culture does not coincide neatly with borders. It tends to spill over really, really easy, even before the age of big data and all of this connectivity. It was very, very hard to keep culture inside of borders. The easiest way, I think was mentioned last night, is food. You can really, really hate somebody, but if they make really good food, you are probably going to figure out an exception in terms of figuring out how to cross over and to have that relationship. So culture is, in fact, the number one reason that borders exist, because we don't know, they're kind of strange, they're doing things differently, but it's also the number one reason that we tear them down. Because I'm curious, they've got something really good going over there, and I want to be a part of that. So the nice thing about culture and borders is that they don't mesh, and usually culture eats border for breakfast. So this is actually a really, really good sign, and I think that part of that actually starts with curiosity. It's something we're actually trying to inspire in our visitors and our audience that we connect with, but I think it's also worth saying that we need to be just as curious about those we serve. The second is a creative welcome. Not just your standard welcome, not kind of like, I don't know if you guys have Walmart, not the Walmart greeter kind of welcome to Walmart, how are you doing today? Creative welcome, the welcome that comes with storytelling, the welcome that comes with dress up, the welcome that comes with love letters from lost loved ones. These creative ways of picking into the universality of our experience, it's the difference between saying, this is a koala nut, and in some communities in Africa, people welcome a guest into their home with a koala nut. Now you've learned about the koala nut. Welcome to the museum. Versus saying this is a koala nut. In certain communities in Africa, they use koala nuts to welcome people into their home. Here, have a koala nut. Now you're actually part of my family for the whole time you're here today. Ooh. Right? That is very, very different and very, very creative. You have just deliberately and creatively given that person license to be welcomed. My God, you use the family word, okay, which can be dangerous in all kinds of ways. And so part of this is around thinking sort of outside the box, outside of these boxes of how we explain things, how we interact with people, particularly if we're trying to do something as dangerous and as difficult as getting people to cross borders. The only kind of in-the-box thinking that I advocate at the Michigan Science Center is when we try to figure out how to get the Science Center in a box so we can ship it across the state, because we have a statewide mandate. And technically, if you've seen my building is shaped like a box, so even that is out of the box thinking, okay? So that is how I'm sort of working inside of those things. But I think one of the things we have to just be willing to take responsibility for is that this is a difficult concept. And so the more creative we are with welcome, then the more successful we will be in creating a space where people can acknowledge that. Because at some point, we can't continue to just pull. People have to be willing to lift their own weight, right? And that takes a sense of comfort and safety. But here is the kicker on this. Thank you. Welcome gets weird when you realize that there were certain borders you had in place that made you feel special. Okay, so when you start knocking down borders that once were created to make you feel special, perhaps it is the elitism of being the only one that has this kind of information. Perhaps it is the umpteen thousand years you spent in school to become the curator that knows this thing. Perhaps it is going from a relatively steep admission price to a free day. When you start to knock down these borders that were part of your identity, that gave you credibility, that made you special, that were part of a title or an accepted role, it gets really weird really quickly. And this is actually part of what's going on in a universal conversation right now around museums, libraries, and archives. This idea of the audience as curator, God help us, right? Okay, but this is that border crossing, and what we are trying to do is we are trying to redefine what makes ourselves special and worthwhile in the age of open data. If I digitize my collection, why would they cross my border to come in and see it? If they can Google the history of the War of 1812, why are they gonna come into my museum or my archive and read about it? So we are redefining that. We are all for this welcome and for tearing down those borders because our ultimate mission is that people know, but it does get sticky because it then does require us to take a look inside and acknowledge that those borders were put there in the first place so that we could be special. But we also have to realize that it wasn't actually the border that made us special in the first place. We were just leaning on the wall. And now is a different age and a different time where now that people are crossing those borders by our own invitation, by our feeding into their curiosity, by our creative welcome, that we can now redefine what that relationship is, what it looks like inside the territory once folks have crossed the border. Number 3, started out with risk-taking. Publicly funded institutions do not take risks. No, we do not. So we're just going to be adventurous instead. So there are always risks involved in true border crossing. Because there always is an element of the unknown. If you're not just a little bit worried about the outcome of whatever it is you're doing, exhibit, program, free day, conversation, focus group, if you think it's about border crossing and you're not the least bit scared, it's not actually border crossing. That is pretty much the way to tell. There is always an element of the unknown. You do know where you want to go, right? The fish wants to get into the other bowl. That is very obvious. We totally know where we want to go. It's that space in between, that space where it's a territory where we may not be able to breathe in there, right? And how exactly is that going to work for us? So there's always this bit of unknown, and it's not really that foolish. It is an adventure. Why would you cross the bowl? Because there are other things in there. So to take this out of the realm of sort of the esoteric, I would use a specific example from the Michigan Science Center. So we're the fish. MiSci, we're the fish. The three acronyms that you see, DAPCEP, DSO, and MOD, are adventurous border crossing relationships that we have recently embarked upon. One of the ideas around becoming the hub for the state of Michigan is these interesting partnerships and collaborations. So the DAPCEP is the Detroit Area Pre-College Engineering Program, otherwise known as Competitor. Right? So they also do hands-on STEM learning. So a partnership there, ooh, that could be really interesting. Okay, is this like bringing a spy in your midst, or are they looking for your donors? Are you really going to invite them to your gala? I don't know about that. Introduce them to a board member or two? I don't know. But at the end of the day, DAPCEP has been around literally 10 times longer than we have. And they serve a distinctly urban population better than we do. If my mission is to save the world, which by the way, I skipped that part, it is, I need to work with groups like DAPCEP that do that. That is a very special border crossing, and it's got that risk embedded because we essentially are trying to do the same thing. The second is MOD. This is the Modern Museum of Design, Detroit. They are at best, 7 days old. This isn't, you know those folks. They come to you, they've got this grand idea, they want to build their own museum. God bless them. Right? And they're so excited and enthusiastic, and they've got interest from several funders. And you know how this can go, right? It's an exciting, cool partnership because they're taking STEM in a different direction, but you could end up carrying them in a way when you can barely support those resources yourself. But they are coming at this from a fashion and design perspective. They are coming at this from an urban design perspective. They are taking the science, technology, engineering, and math in a very different way, and we need that. So we want to cross that border and see what happens. The DSO is the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Enough said. Why is the Science Center collaborating with the symphony? Do we even speak the same language? And I refuse to do simple things like the science of sound. So we're going to have to go a little bit further. But each one of these collaborations get into the bowl of making a bigger difference. But each one of them come with a particular brand of risk and the unknown. But the outcome of crossing those borders successfully could really, really be amazing. So that's it. So those are my three ideas about what I think it takes to do some really successful, strategic border crossing. We want to be curious. We want to be creatively welcoming. We want to be adventurous. So we turn this version of border crossing into this version of border crossing for us and for all of our audiences. Because at the end of the day, that is actually how we get over. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Matthews. That was inspiring. That was terrific. I think that perked everybody in the room up. I think we needed that. So on behalf of the Local Arrangements Committee and the OMA Council, I want to thank you. I want to give you this as well. And on behalf of all Canadians, I do want to apologize for Justin Bieber. We shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. Thank you. There'll be another session starting up at 9:30.